So I need to thank some sponsors really quick before we get into our next act. Special thanks to our corporate sponsors, AECOM, Burkett Engineering, Canyon Creative, Color Reflections, Crafted Design, Demo Day Productions, DJW, ta-da, EXP, Good Theory Studios, Nolan Hyman, VCI Event Technology, Visual Terrain. I think I went too fast, sorry about that. Now, I'd like to introduce a man who has been a thorn in the side of the establishment and patriarchy since high school. You should have read what he really wanted me to read. Talking a classmate into growing a mustache and being expelled for it, he led the successful legal movement for abolishing high school dress codes in Oregon, and that was only the beginning of a long career. He's been on TEA stages before, bearing flags for women's rights, animal rights, human rights, intergenerational fights, and HIV/AIDS. Today, Kile Ozier will do what he does best and make a case for how we can forge communications across cultures and backgrounds in his talk, The Power of Pageantry, Spectacle as a Force for Good. His presentation is, in every respect, all good. Kile Ozier, ladies and gentlemen.
That's sweet, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, yes. That's what it's about. So yes, I'm sorry, I have nothing controversial to discuss today. So this is gonna be the teddy bear in the room. No elephants. All right, so when the question first came up about, well, let me share you. The question that I was asked in putting this together, I was asked, do you think, well, that spectacle has the potential to create community across cultures? Well, of course, the answer is yes. And I think we all know that that's the nature of theater, is creating a moment of community. Is that me? I don't have fierce hair. But in looking at the question, I think, and in fact, I want to say that a lot of what I'm going to talk about are really things we already know, doing what we do. But in investigating the question and looking at it deeper, theater creates a moment of community. Spectacle creates a moment of community. But is that something that can go deeper? And if we wanted to go deeper, what are the best techniques and methodologies and approaches to doing that? So, but first, a definition of term. I use the term spectacle versus spectacular because for me, okay, I timed it myself. This is spectacle, and this is spectacular. And so is this. Well, equal opportunity. So in looking at the question, and the question was actually born from a conversation about, these are 4 of my 5, you've heard me probably talk about these before, I write about them, my tenets of creating compelling experience, connecting emotionally. But the key to this conversation is my 5th of subliminal engagement. Now that's what I call something, and I'm sure we all do, which is engaging the audience in the creation of their own experience. The best example, the most vivid example or far-reaching is Julie Taymor's costume methodology for Lion King. And we all know that if the audience participates in creating their own experience, it's more compelling. It becomes more personal. And I have a theory, though, taking this further, that I call creating a moment of shared, intimate experience. And by that I mean the audience, outcome, sorry guys, the false teeth, I don't know. The audience, the outcome, the zebras, everybody's watching the zebras, but they all see their experience of zebra. Whatever their first zebra was, whether it was in a zoo or a magazine or a documentary, or they were in Africa, or it was a stuffed animal. They all see their zebra, and at the same moment, I see mine, the next to me sees hers, the kid next to me sees his, but there's a shared moment in the entire space of recognition, and then it's gone. But so while we're all seeing we're all sharing a moment of recognition and embracing, we're seeing something different. It's a shared, intimate experience, and that was where the beginning of this conversation came. So in being asked the question, I thought I would actually approach our icons in our industry and see what the big guys think of this. I mean, this is a question I decided to share. So what I did was interview, most of you know most of these people. All of you have seen the work of all of these people. So I conducted amazing interviews with each of them by Skype and whatever part of the world they were in that I could reach them, and cut each of these. I mean, they were great conversations. We actually now have enough raw material to do an 8-week seminar series on the questions that came up. And one thing, thank you, much appreciated. And one thing that, although this is a topic, I do want to note, I don't know which one of these is working. I'm not working. I noticed these are all white men except for one woman. That has not gone, even in our conversations, that has not gone unnoticed. So, but it is another conversation for another time. I just don't want you to think I'm overlooking it. So I've interviewed each of these guys. I've cut these people. I've cut each one down to about a minute and a half, and I'm going to play through each one and then show you. Okay. Anyway, let me just get started.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a captivating question, right? And it's one that we're all really committed to. I was recently at an immersive design summit in San Francisco, and it was a big topic of conversation around how can immersive theater actually become an agent for social change. And I think that's so fascinating in the work that we do. A young woman named Michael Tara Garver, who's an incredible theater director from New York that I need to introduce you to, led this really articulate and stunning panel around that topic. And she invited people from all different realms, not only from theater or from video or from virtual reality, but from governmental change, from political activism, from comic books. And one of the examples was there was a group called Wakanda Forever, who have taken the idea of Wakanda from the Black Panther mythology that Marvel created and posits the idea that what if Wakanda was a real world idea where science and technology were creating something that really could change how we think about the world, but also this notion of using culture as an interface for that, and how, again, we're starting to break down walls and build cultures that now are looking at things from a different perspective. And for me, it was a really humbling experience because, wow, Marvel is not only generated this kind of shorthand with audiences and this kind of love for the characters and the content that they're providing, but are actually instigating and inspiring people to think about real world situations where these characters could have an impact, where we could not only cross culture, but actually start to think about using technology, creating, common forums and common dialogues that would allow us to really penetrate that on a different level. And I was so engaged by that dialogue and by what Michael Tara Garver's group, which is called XP13, are trying to do.
So in the broader conversation, Michael referenced a couple of interesting, I'm sure you saw of spectacle or experiences that create a community. For instance, you've probably seen the seesaws through the Trump's wall. Obviously created community by community. The Carney Arena that LACMA produced, a virtual reality experience of immigrants crossing the border, being chased down, actually kind of on the model of the Holocaust Museum, in that each individual actually took on the identity and experience of an immigrant who had made it through. And it was, as I say, it's 3D, it's virtual reality, and when they got through the experience after being chased, through the fields and captured or not. Then they received a brief on the person that they had actually been representing. So again, this is sharing community, if not creating community.
Created an image of the nation that people now associate with those characteristics. Mm-hmm. If you saw that ceremony, you associate those characteristics with Azerbaijan, and that is part of how a great spectacle creates this bridge and introduces some things that we know about a country, and perhaps that we don't know. But you need to connect those moments of familiarity to bridge so that people go on that journey and jump with you. Yeah. I mean, and for me personally, it's part of the great joy. I love to learn. I love to experience the culture as deeply as I can. I'm respectful. I'm never going to understand the depth and the nuance of the Azeri culture, but to embrace it in a deep enough way to represent it in a way that the host nation embraces, that's a great joy. And when we get that right, and the host nation people walk away from the stadium, they walk away from the show feeling they saw their country in its most favorable light, and they're proud. There's an intense pride. That's what makes me really excited about the work we get to do.
One of the things that Scott talked about is again, I believe that all of us use these sorts of steps and methodologies to create what we create. Important. Actually, it's kind of like an AA meeting where you hear somebody talking, and you're like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm not the only one. And actually, some of the in these conversations, this is a sidebar, but this industry, those of you who are also in spectacle, know that a lot of the agencies that do spectacle are like little fortresses. They don't communicate with each other, they compete with each other, they're friendly rivals. But it came up again and again that wouldn't it be great if we actually were more of a community and could, pool our creative resources and share them. So there's a mandate for TEA to reach out to a subgroup or something. Anyway, so again, these are the steps of Scott's process, the keys being investigation, listening, learning. If the first step needs to be hearing, learning about what it is, the story we're trying to tell. When people ask me where my ideas come from, it's always the client. They may not know it, but as I interview, first steps, somebody will say something that starts the process of what they can have. So as I come back to them, wow, you can do this, you can do that, maybe we should do the story this way, you're actually showing them what came out of their head, so they have ownership.
And speaking of that, I'd like to go back to you've got to do your homework, right? You have to do your homework and you have to listen. There was a day, if I'm being obvious, of course I am, but there was a day where all of us would go into a new culture and just do what we do because we think that's right and that's the way to do it. And we've all become a lot better listeners. We've had to do it. We certainly did it in China. We couldn't go in that way. We had to go in. We had to listen. We had to understand what appealed, what didn't appeal. We're better together with our local partners and trying to figure out what's the best product. That's not new that's not old to us. That's relatively new, to be honest. We put a lot of time into that. So you have to do your homework, to Stephen's point. You have to really listen to where you are.
I think he's right when he says, take your script and now erase as much as you can, because I remember the first big fireworks show I did. It was a 3-page script, or actually a 3-page story. It wasn't even a script at that point. And it all boiled down to one sentence. I wish I never had to leave this magical place. That's what the whole thing was about. But it took 3 pages to tell this backstory. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter about the backstory. It was about the feeling and the expression that you want to leave. When we were doing the ending, I had 2 endings. We wrote 2 different ones. One was specific, that had a theme song, and it was edited within an inch of its life to media. And I showed it to one of the executives, and they turned around crying, going, "This is fantastic, and I'm crying for all the wrong reasons." Because it's so manipulative that you've taken me here, but we forcefully did it. Then I played her "Let There Be Peace on Earth" with Heather Headley, singing the lead of it, which was this epic 4-minute piece. And she turned around crying again, going, "You have to do this piece." I go, "But we have no visuals." She goes, "This is the visual." Smartest thing I was ever told, the last 5 years. The words are the visual here. People can now paint whatever they want. Let the color, let anything you want to do here without seeing a piece of media be the story, and let everyone else make up their own story in their mind. And because that's where your brilliance will come with the new talent. I mean, I have great teams that I work with, and they're young. I'm not afraid of them. Hey, bring them on. They're going to teach me something, but they are the future. So don't be afraid of the future. Embrace the future and move with it, and teach them, because that's the way. This medium will only work if you keep teaching the next version, or teaching what we know to the next group, and let them reinvent it and have the next big thing.
So, candor, openness, what I call underproduction, his discovery, which I'm sure we've all discovered. It's so easy to start complicating things, and really, we'll get to that. I don't want to steal the thunder of one of our speakers, but the things that really stood out in our overall conversation here were the comments about, creating an experience that's more evocative. Again, so the audience, they didn't put them in my words about, completing the work or subliminal engagement, but evoking the story, not articulating the story. Anybody who saw Warhorse, the theatrical production, has a great example of that. Obviously, listening is up there a lot because it comes up all the time. And I thought that was very candid of Roger to talk about the lessons they learned essentially in Disneyland Paris, and change their entire approach, at least for most of the executives, for Shanghai. Their whole, what was it? It was uniquely Disney, inherently Chinese. It was a really great, methodology. And also, not letting the technology take over the craft. Again, I know you know this, but it's just good to hear it again, and it's good to hear it from all these people. Don't let your technology get in the way of the story. As simple as it can be is the way to do it, is to connect people to it. Now here's the famous
the words
Eve.
which are explaining the situations, or explaining or decrypting the feelings and so on. So I think they are very often not necessary and not useful. I like the shows which are using as less word as possible. And in the work we are doing, sometimes we are writing dialogues with words. And a step further, my work is to erase all the words which are not necessary. To say, is it really necessary to say that? To convey the feeling. And very often, we can divide by 3 the number of words, maybe even more. Complexity is not a value in the way in the communication field. The complexity is something which is, and we don't need to make the shows complicated with too many feelings at the same time, too many events at the same time. The line of the stories, the line of the events has to be clear for the people, and yes, simplicity is a value.
Yeah, I wasn't able to edit out my guffaw. It's, yes, complexity is not a value. Simplicity is the value. Yves, this is a quote from the Greater Conversation, and he got a Thea Award for this Luz de Voices del Tajín from us, obviously. But he talked about, we talked about not using words, not having language. The only breakaway from that is, for instance, for this show, they used an ancient language that nobody speaks. So there's no inclination for people to try to understand it. It was all vocal intonation. You could express a lot of emotion with voices without distracting the audience. So it's a gift, really. And Cirque du Soleil does that masterfully, really. Next, I need to get through this fast because.
So I think art and creativity is what transforms a very good technological planning into a masterpiece. But also the challenge for each one of us is to create a beautiful show with a small budget out of very big idea, because the idea changes it all. I think we have to be one team and to respect each other. And this is another level of challenge we all have to face. It doesn't work if we divide everything, the production process, into small boxes.
No.
There should be a match between us and the client. You can't produce show for everyone. I mean, there should be a match. It's not. We should be the perfect artist for the client.
But really, what I take away from that, especially, is not having silos. The more people you can, the more, and we've heard this on other panels here. The more collaborative your group can be, with disparately talented and skilled people. You know, if the technicians are in the same room with the creatives as they're coming up with the concept, they're there to help come up with creative solutions rather than judge or try to fix it later. I mean, we all know this, but it's very hard sometimes, certainly in the agency world, to get clients or agencies to break down some of those silos and walls. And as she says, you know, also learning to just say no to a client that you know you're not going to fit with.
So our ability to design things, to create things, and that's what separates us. If we can create a way to communicate with one another across different platforms that don't necessarily have to use, that have to be dependent on words, then Spectacle can most certainly do something like that. And you're enjoying the light, and you're enjoying very often the sound. So that ties again back to the beginning of civilization. It's always been about mankind coming together over light and sound, over fire and drums, or whether or not it's, you know, fireworks up in the sky, all one. And when we are experiencing a large spectacle together, when we're actually listening to one big story together, it brings us together as a civilization. So if what separates us from all the other species is our ability to tell stories, in other words, our ability to be creative, to have an imagination, then grand spectacle is the obvious solution for how we're going to wind up actually bringing ourselves together and doing something to help save humanity. The most transformative was at President Obama's first inauguration, because it was holy, and I'll never forget the feeling in that room and how we were all transformed. Not just the participants, those of us who were performing, but also the audience. And you felt this oneness. You felt this happen. It was a magnificent event. But one of my very favorites actually was doing the Gay Games, because the Gay Games was an enormous event, and it had so many different athletes that were there, that were participating, and also an enormous amount of spectators in the Soldiers Field. But we were all there knowing that there was a cause that we were there for that was greater than just the sport, and was greater than the competition. And again, you felt that the stories that the spectacle told really brought the entire stadium together. It was a magnificent event, really, truly.
So spectacle can be commemorative, it's celebratory, it's transformative, it can be cathartic, it can be almost any size, but it always creates community.
The quilt on the Mall in Washington in October of 1987. I think the biggest issue in the country was around AIDS was that everyone was either us or them. Either this was your problem or this was clearly not my problem. And there was really no talking between the two. We had, in the Castro, for instance, 1,000 men had died in a 10-block radius of Castro Market. And even people in that own community weren't sharing stories and letting people know that they were taking care of someone or that they were sick. And there was really no way to deal with the grief. And there was no way to get through that barrier that everybody had up around them. The same thing we found out later was happening with mothers in communities all across the country whose adult sons had died of AIDS, usually in a city somewhere away from home. The mother had heard about the quilt and was making a panel for her dead son. She couldn't tell her church group what her son died of. There was no one to talk to about this. And she would make a beautiful quilt panel the size of a grave, 3 feet by 6 feet, and send it to us in San Francisco, to a bunch of gay men she didn't even know. That's how deep the loneliness was. And when we finally got the quilt open on the mall, we gave a lot of thought to the ritual of it. But silence fell over the place like you wouldn't believe. And people took the hand of a person they didn't know. Or they turned and hugged someone who had started to cry and they didn't know them 2 minutes before. And in an instant, the visual that we created, the unifying, colorful symbol of AIDS, which is not thought of as unifying and colorful and warm. And this thing blossomed on the National Mall at dawn. And there were probably 10,000 people there, over the course of the day. We also, by that night, we were on the national news in every country. We were above the fold in every newspaper in the world. The whole world, I think, suddenly saw AIDS differently. And it happened in an instant.
Now, newspapers used to be how you got your news, is before the web. And so that's why it's an important, that became worldwide. And as you know, it really changed the way AIDS, it created a community really worldwide. So the answer is yes. Obviously the answer is yes before we even go in. But I think that for me, this was a great exercise in refinding and refining methods. I think that we all do our best to create the most amazing and most emotionally connective story at magnitude or smaller. But I think if we look through the lens of community and reaching beyond the audience that we might have in the stadium or the behind the berm or whoever it is, it might make a difference in our product at the other end, the nuance. And it's interesting that somebody else brought up the Twin Towers. This is a spectacle that brought the world together. We find lessons in nature of simplicity that is profoundly compelling. And then there are the Rockettes. You can, but a whale breaching, a glacier calving can be as compelling and memorable and create community as that experience is shared as much as any production of ours. And there are lessons that we have available to us to use as a lens through which we create. Interestingly, when I asked the question of the most compelling experience, that all these people, when they would just pick one at random, 2/3 of the time, was this Adam Bizark? Was this, and Steve Burkett? Sorry, oops. Anyway, which is also one of my favorite, and I haven't even seen it, other than on video several times. And then my personal, the memory that stays with me the most visceral experience I have had was when those taiko drums come out of the ceiling and the stair. Because, and again, you completely circumvented preconception. These huge, heavy drums are flying from the sky. Anyway, every time I see this, I am moved. I just think that's a kind of thing that is simple, really, other than gravity and physics. So my answer is yes. It's just all a matter of our focus and how we do it.